Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here this evening. My name is Tarek Jazil, and along with Professor Paul Gilroy, I'm co-director of the Sarah Parker Remond Centre for the Study of Racism and Racialisation. And we're really delighted to welcome you all here for this very special evening, which is actually it's our inaugural Sarah Parker Remond Memorial Lecture. So obviously we intend to have this lecture every year, but this is our first one, and we're really delighted also that Professor Ian Baucom is here to deliver the lecture today, this evening. In a very short minute, I'm going to recede until the question and answer and discussion following the lecture, and I'm going to hand over to Paul to say a little bit more about our centre and also to properly introduce our speaker for today. Just before I do that, I also just want to say a big thank you to Kaiser, who's at the back, taking pics, for all the amazing work that's gone into setting this up and getting things ready for the lecture. It's important to acknowledge that work. So I'll just hand over to Paul, who's going to introduce this.
Well, let me echo what Tarek's already said. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here this evening and to inaugurate the tradition of the Sarah Parker Remond Memorial Lecture. I don't want to assume that those of you who come this evening know anything about Sarah. Here she is. This is the representation of her that hangs upstairs in our space, produced by the Swiss, Haitian, Finnish artist Sasha Huber, who's actually got a show opening in London in a week or so if you want to go and investigate. So I thought before I introduce Professor Baucom, I would say one or two things about Sarah Parker Remond and why she was an appropriate choice as our avatar for the project that we have been building here at UCL. Those of you who are familiar with this, please forgive me. Sarah was an abolitionist, an orator, a suffragist, an activist, a nurse, and a physician. Somebody who had political and professional accomplishments that touched a number of different locations. She was born in Salem, Massachusetts, and lived, I think, in Cape Cod also. Her father had been a migrant from Curacao in the West Indies and had built up a long and successful career in Salem as a caterer and a hairdresser and an entrepreneur of different sorts. She was educated in Salem public schools, at Bedford College here in London, and also at UCL. In her early schooling, she distinguished herself as a linguist. And like her companion and collaborator, Frederick Douglass, she was a brilliant orator in the cause of ultra-abolitionism. Indeed, one Irish activist who listened to her eloquence described her like this: she's really very clever. The equal of Douglass, though, quote, a very much more sensible and thoroughgoing person than he. Remond often worked with her brother, Charles Lennox Remond, and together their rhetoric and their energy gripped audiences, not, we are told, in her case, by an emotional or sentimental recital of the horrors of slavery, quote, but by, quote, a clear elucidation of just principles. Her aim was, again to quote, to extend the active sympathy of the whole British nation towards the cause of abolitionism in America. After living here for a number of years and working in the cause of anti-slavery and abolition, writing to the Times and the London Daily News in 1865 in support of the rebellion in Jamaica and protesting against the coverage of that event in the British press, the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865, she settled into the kind of radical bubble of London's Holland Park, where she was active in a range of different social movements and campaigns there, lodging for a period at the home of the Liberal MP Peter Taylor and his wife Clementia Taylor, lodging at their house, Aubrey House in Aubrey Road, if anybody knows Holland Park. I think it's just adjacent to where Dusty Springfield lived when she was living in that same street. That radical culture in West London was illuminated by frequent visits of Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi, who stayed there in 1864. And the Taylors were known for their social gatherings. They were supporters of the arts. They had a pen and pencil club, which was a place where young writers and artists could read together and be exhibited. I hope you can see why Sarah became important to us. After her studying at Bedford College and her time spent here at UCL, she found it impossible to qualify as a doctor. She wanted to be an obstetrician, and what we now call a gynecologist, and she moved to Italy in 1866. She took the habilitation examination and became an obstetrician in 1868. She married a Sardinian, and she practiced medicine in Rome for the duration of her life, where she was a close associate of Edmonia Lewis, the artist who lived on the same piazza. She died in Florence in 1894 at the age of 79 and was buried in Rome, where in 2014 a memorial plaque was erected in her memory in the English cemetery. Well, she was not only a dynamic political voice against racial hierarchy and for gender equality, but also a woman of science and medicine. And her life reveals a compelling history of the ways in which the pursuit of civil and political rights and citizenship by Black people has been connected to the acquisition of rights and recognition by women. So this is how and why we celebrate her, remember her, and inaugurate this tradition, which, as Tarek has already said, I hope will become an annual event. And there is really no more appropriate speaker to inaugurate this than Professor Ian Baucom, who's come so generously from the University of Virginia, UVA, where he serves in the office of Executive Vice President and Provost, having previously been Dean of the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Before going to UVA, Professor Baucom served 17 years at Duke University's Department of English and was a director of the famous John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute. Professor Baucom is the author of several landmark publications. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with that extraordinary body of work. He has published in 20th century British literature and culture, post-colonial and cultural studies, on African and Black Atlantic literatures, and edited a number of publications, special issues, South Atlantic Quarterly, Atlantic Studies, Romanticism and Climate Change has been a recent and an important focus of his work. He's the co-editor of Out of Place, Englishness, Empire. No, the author of that, Ian, I'm sorry. I got my pages slightly muddled. Here we are. In conjunction with David A. Bailey, the Black British photographer and artist, and Sonia Boyce, recently hailed and appreciated in Venice. Professor Baucom co-edited Shades of Black, Assembling Black Arts in 1980s Britain in 2005. Most recently, Professor Baucom is the author of History, 4 Degrees Celsius. And I think that's a text, an extraordinary text, a rich text in which he discusses the planetary crisis of climate change and its relationship to the distinct material histories of the colony and the post-colony. And it's this topic to which he'll return this evening in his lecture. Professor Baucom's intriguing title for his presentation is The Future Claimant's Representative. Professor Baucom.
Starting a clock. Paul, thank you. I was saying to Tariq earlier that when Paul Gilroy invites you to speak, you speak. I've done some wise things in my life, and I've done some foolish things, but one of the things I think of greater wisdom is that early on as a graduate student, Paul, I began to read your work. And I began to take advantage of your profound hospitality. And there are a handful of occasions in life in which you get to honor someone who has been an intellectual mentor and a friend. And Paul, you've been that for me for many decades. So thank you for that. So it's a profound honor, a true honor to be delivering the inaugural Sarah Parker Remond Memorial Lecture. I'm glad that you're all here, and I'm looking forward to your questions and our conversation at the end of the talk. When Paul first invited me, he suggested that I might say a few things about the implications I've drawn from this most recent book, History 4 Degrees Celsius, for the racial orders and cultural and political logics of our moment, the truly long, history accumulating and future extending moment in which we find ourselves. And then to share some thoughts on where that text is now leading me in a very preliminary follow-on project. With that in mind, I thought I might start by providing a brief overview of the book, knowing that many of you won't have had the chance to read it, and then to sketch an outline of some of the unfinished questions with which it's left me. So as a quick set of conversation-setting thoughts, the fundamental goal of the book is to address two intersecting cycles of accumulation in the making of the modern world, and to consider a method for putting those cycles into conversation with one another. The first of those is the cycle of capital accumulation and its allied practices of racial violence in the histories of slavery and colonialism across the Black Atlantic world from the 18th century to the present. And the second is the cycle of carbon accumulation over that same period, a cycle originating plausibly from the 1784 invention of the steam engine, the catastrophic climate change which carbon-based fossil fuels have produced, and the violence that carbon cycle is wreaking unevenly over the planet, an unevenness which maps almost exactly onto the maps of empire, transatlantic slavery, Black Atlantic history, and the global post-colony. Alternately put, the goal of the book is to think about the relationship between the long histories of postcolonia, diaspora, and subaltern studies, and the equally long histories of climate change, and to ask what those fields of critical inquiry need to learn from one another. Or as one last and more particular way of putting it, its purpose is to consider the deep entanglements and exchanges that exist between the Black Atlantic as a cultural, historical, and political zone, and the Black Atlantic as a climate-changed ocean, and to ask how those two Black Atlantics converge. Within the book, I try to encapsulate those questions in a formula by talking about the dialectic of forces and forcings, the dialectical interplay of the historical forces of racial violence, empire, and capital with the geophysical climate forcings, sun flares, carbon accumulation, ocean bleaching, Arctic melting, and sea level rise of the climate-changed epoch of the Anthropocene, and to do so with the understanding that those cycles are not independent of one another, with the idea that the force of history, capital history, colonial history, race history, is what has thrown us into this climate-changed Anthropocene epoch, and that the forcings of climate change continuously interact with the ongoing lived reality of those historical forces of violence to exacerbate their effects and damages. If you've had a chance to look at the book, you'll know that part of my effort is to keep thinking those questions to an organizing set of images. There are a series of photographs by the Ghanaian photographer Nyani Kwame entitled "We Were Once 3 Miles from the Sea," depicting a series of coastal sites on the Ghanaian shore near a series of Atlantic slave factories, now overwhelmed by climate-driven ocean rise. Throughout the book, I try to understand the interplay between the slave fort and the ocean rising sea, and to ask how those images can help us understand our moment, how they can help us comprehend a we no longer distant from the sea. A second broad goal of the book is to engage with the emerging notion of the planetary, as that plays out within practices of contemporary critical thought. I do so with the proposition that the planetary is only apprehensible through the vernacular specificity of the global and the colonial and the post-colony, and the logics, practices, and histories of race and race violence behind them. Or, in Achille Mbembe's terms, I argue that to apprehend the planetary depends on apprehending the becoming Black of the planet, or more simply, that we cannot come to the planetary abstractly. We can only come to it specifically and historically, particularly here through the post-colony shore, through that Ghanaian beach. The third key argument of the book is that to apprehend the relationship between the planet and the post-colony requires us to work simultaneously across multiple scales of time and analysis. I lay those out as the biographical scale of the individual human life. All those unique, named, and singular lives on the shore. The nomological scale of societies, states, and polities in which those lives are enmeshed. The biological scale of the human species over deep time to which all polities belong. The zoological scale of human life as but one form of life among many other non-human forms. The geological scale of the history of the planet across its multi-millennial time, and the cosmological scale of the history of the planet within the almost unimaginably deep time of the universe. The last main objective of the book is to think about how these different but overlapping scales of analysis produce different but overlapping conceptions of the we of who we are now, the we of who we were once, 3 miles from the sea, but no longer so, and the we of who we are and can or must choose to become, individually, in our lived cultural realities, and as planetary inhabitants, as we pass into our long future together, as those seas rise, those deserts advance, those summer heats kill, those floods come. In asking those questions, the final purpose of the book is to think about how those different passages through the we produce differing and tangled accounts of freedom, and how it remains the task of critical thought to ask how that we can be free, whether we approach that question from a humanist or a post-humanist guise. To answer that question, I finished the book by asking the question of freedom, the question of the we and the free through a range of approaches. First, through the idea of a classical freedom from sovereign violence, freedom from arbitrary constraint. Second, by an equally long imagined freedom to health and to education, freedom to self-fashioning and to cultural production. And finally, by means of a newer conception of freedom toward the good of a polity and the good of the planetary, freedom toward blending the good of the self with the good of the species, the good of all life, life human and non-human, freedom toward blending the good of life that has been afforded some kind of legal protection with life that lacks recognition and standing, life thrown away, life ignored, life unadmitted. So much for that book. What now comes from it? Here are a few preliminary questions and speculations, which I've arranged in 3 parts. The first, under the idea, the title, which I hope to explain, of the future claimant's representative. The second, under the heading of the university, in a state of urgency. The third, under the rubric of desire lines, which will try to thread those earlier strands together. So part 1, the future claimant's representative. If it is the case that we come to the planetary present from the post-colony's historical shore, then how do we think not only about that historical past, which isn't in fact past, and the claims it makes on us, but also about our climate-changed planetary future, which isn't in fact future, but already arriving, and the claims that future makes on us? How simultaneously do we entangle ourselves with that future, with its forces and forcings, with its scales of time, and its struggles for freedom? I'm really just starting to think about those questions, and I don't have developed arguments, but here are a few organizing points of departure. The future is something that we are already colonizing. The future and those who will live in it are already coming to us as an accelerated version of the colony and the post-colony, damaged and wrecked by what we do now. Even as is already coming, already arriving, that future and those who will live in it has no legal standing, no structure of formal protection or recognition, at least by the laws of sovereign nations. Instead, the future climate change planet and all those who will live in it comes to us as objected and disposable. Coming so, the future and all who will live in it comes to us like a colonial subject before imperial power, like a racialized subject before race violence. And as the future comes at us so, one of the key tasks of critical thought now is to understand how to situate ourselves in relationship to that already arriving claim of the future's subalterns, much as we have learned to situate ourselves toward history's claims and history's subalterns. As I've begun to think about those propositions, there is an enigmatic figure I've become aware of that might provide one avenue of response: the future claimant's representative, a legal character who the court appoints in mass tort claims, say in a lawsuit against an asbestos manufacturer, when the court knows that while the damage of the asbestos has already been done, some of its victims are too young to yet fully experience its violence in their bodies, or themselves to petition before the court to make their claim. So someone is appointed now to speak for them, the future claimant's representative. Frederick Tung has provided a concise description. The future claimant's representative, he writes, is, quote, a court-appointed agent named to represent then nameless, faceless future victims of acts already committed. Their mandate is to negotiate on behalf of future claimants, asserting their rights. The future claims representative device makes possible a sort of constructive participation by future claimants so that they may be party to any resulting settlement, unquote. While recognized in tort law, particularly in bankruptcy procedures against corporations profiting from the mass use of hazardous materials, the future claimants representative has not, to my knowledge, yet been recognized either in constitutional law or international law. That attempt is being made across a range of legal actions worldwide, perhaps most famously in the US at least, in the case of Juliana versus the United States, an environmental and constitutional rights claim brought on behalf of an array of youth petitioning the court on behalf of future youth, but thus far without definitive success. Largely, as the legal theorist Randall S. Abate has observed in his recent Climate Change and the Voiceless, because while courts have been willing to recognize that certain non-human actors, among them primates and rivers, and discrete future human subjects of particular toxins, have legal standing, and so the right to be represented, the courts have not yet acknowledged the legal standing either of the planet as a whole or of the future as a category in itself. Nevertheless, Abate argues with each incremental advance, it is, quote, no longer a matter of whether this legal revolution will occur, but only a matter of when and how. That is hopeful and to be hoped and advocated for. But if that advocacy is to succeed and if that legal revolution is to come, it will not be enough to rely on the efforts of juridical actors alone. It will depend on expanding a conception of the future claimant's representative beyond the judicial sphere into the spheres of critical practice and the arts, and to the work and the mission of the university itself. Before offering some thoughts on what that might entail, I would like to take a cautionary note from the legal discourse. To return to Tung's overview, while the figure of the future claimant's representative can be, perhaps should be, understood as providing a vehicle through which a subaltern future can speak into our present, it nevertheless requires careful scrutiny. And that, as he writes, is because, quote, the future claimant's representative is in essence an agent without a principal or a client. She or he or they or we is and are not answerable to her and our ostensible beneficiaries. Indeed, the absence of the principal is the very circumstance requiring the invention of the device. Given the pressure of competing claimants to settle a contested matter, one must understandably question whether this mechanism can be expected truly to provide zealous representation for future claimants who do not choose and cannot monitor their agent. Moreover, their losses are not vivid, but abstract and prospective, while the losses of competing living claimants are real and apparent. The future principals, the beneficiaries of the future claimants' representative actions, may thus have enormous individual and collective stakes in the subject of their representative's agency, but a complete inability to assure the faithfulness of their agent. This is chastening. As I've indicated, I am inviting us to consider our agency as this form of future claimants' representative agency. I am asking what we might gain from considering that to be one of our tasks of thought and one of the tasks of the university. What it might mean to consider ourselves to be both the past's and the future's representatives. But as I do so, I want to underline these cautions, which articulate the classic double cautions of representative agency that Edward Said brought before us in highlighting Marx's dictum from the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte as one of the key problematics of Orientalism. They cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. If a future comes before us as something we are already colonizing, something denied the ability to represent itself, something without standing, then even as we imagine what it might mean to be that abjected and precarious future's representatives, we will need to ask these dual questions of representation, further developed by Gayatri Spivak once again. From the mimetic register of representation, Spivak's Darstellung, can we find ways to make that future something other than abstract, prospective, statistically predictable? Can we apprehend it in its own vernaculars as something urgent and vivid? Can we find a new mode of representation for the future, particularly the planet's altered climate future, complementing, but not in the first instance driven by statistical modeling, data sets, econometrics, futures markets, derivatives pricing, the risk analyses of catastrophe insurance and reinsurance? Can we find idioms to make that future in the first instance something sufficiently vivid, affective, and claiming, so that the future's claims on us constantly precede, exceed, and trouble a simple, deterministic, or reductively exclusive, data-informed mode of decision-making? Can we at the same time imagine a register of future representation in which we do not only open a view from the present, looking out ahead at time to come, but a register through which we can see the future looking back at us, querying us and the decisions we are now making on its politically unrepresented and currently unrepresentable behalf? A future gaze looking back at us and holding us accountable for what we do now. With those queries in mind and turning to Spivak's more definitively political register of representation, her Vertutung, even if we can make that urgent future singular and vivid and find ourselves held vivid by it, will we in consequence hold ourselves faithful to being the agents of the enormous individual and collective stakes we are offering to represent? Weighing the losses of maneuver, of consumption, of freedom that the living present may need to make if we are to entangle the project of our freedom with and toward the freedom of a future from which we are no longer truly distant. Will we faithfully represent that living future? Will we hold ourselves answerable to a future that will hold us accountable? Or discouraged or in despair by the sheer enormity of the task, will we shrug, hold our eyes down, and turn away from that unsettling gaze? Will we wrap up the negotiations, the next Paris or Edinburgh summit, as practically as possible? Will we settle? With those questions and cautions in mind, a few words. To return to the question of what it might take to apprehend the climate change future of the planet as vivid rather than abstract, the key to that task, for me at least, is to continue to hold the idea that the image of the future is a mirror of the image of the past, precisely to the extent to which the future reflects the becoming planetary of prior global conditions, of life without standing. Or much more simply, if we want to know what the future will look like, look to what life has historically been made to be, when it is held to have no standing, no protection, no right. I suggested earlier that the future climate change planet comes to us as something abjected and disposable. The future and all who will live in it comes like a colonial subject before imperial power, like a racialized subject before race violence. I want to hold to that, but with a degree of more particularity and question for investigation. How so, and in what form? By a starting point of answer, I believe there is a deep line of inquiry on all these questions to follow on from I.L. Weitzman's investigations of the intersection between coloniality, race, environmental reengineering, and what he calls the aridity line, in the remarkable work he has pursued with the artist and photographer Fazel Sheikh in their Erasure trilogy and their joint investigation of the Israel-Palestine conflict shoreline. If I were to summarize their investigations under a single organizing rubric, it would be by way of suggesting that the planetary mirroring and refraction of prior logics of colonialism, race, biopolitics, and governmentality is now proceeding under a logic of environmentality. The race line, the color line, the enemy line, the biopolitical line, the line dividing those who governmental power will currently make live or let die, is now being reconstrued and fraudulently deracialized as an environmental line. A line drawn between the green zone of flourishing cities and economies and the line of the desert. A line between sustenance and those who can sustain themselves, and the unsustainable and the thirsty. The line between the productive and the arid. As Weitzman and Sheikh's work on Israel, Palestine, and the Negev shows, however, aridity is not a natural condition. It is produced. The aridity line is not inherent in nature. It is manufactured as a practice of what I am suggesting we think about as environmentality, a practice of producing deserts or drained watersheds or desiccated rivers, to cultivate farms, gardens, hypercities, and factories, pushing populations behind the drought line, and then finding, because they are discovered there in the arid zone they have putatively failed to cultivate, that the people in these climate-ruined geographies, which once again map almost exactly onto the maps of empire and plantation and colony, that these people lack standing as potentially productive contributors to the green zone, the Schengen zone, the European cities on the northern shore of the Sahel and the far side of the cross-Mediterranean passage, the green-lawned American suburbs beyond the Rio Grande. That the people of the arid zone have no right to cross the line to the green zone and can be let die in the desert and the river and the Mediterranean drowning waters. That is a new grammar for an old story, a new way of naming, organizing, and policing the movement of populations, where the aridity line putatively replaces the race line while merely reinforcing it, and where environmentality becomes just the newest form of governmentality. But even as thinking the phase shift from governmentality to environmentality does not fundamentally alter our understanding of the present and its modes of power, it does have some larger consequences on our understanding of the future. For it is not only the millions of lives currently held to be without standing that the emerging logics of environmentality abandon. Under the codes of that mutating logic, the future itself, with the atmosphere changes and soil erosion and agricultural collapse and desertification we are visiting on it, is also already living beyond the aridity line. Or to make an image of it, the future is the Negev and the Sahari and the Kalahari and the Chihuahuan desert zones as they have been produced, and all the future desert poors seeking to cross across the aridity we are making. As the future is also the becoming planetary of the drowning waters of the Mediterranean and the Rio Grande, and Lee County, Florida, and the Abacos in the Bahamas, and the floodplains of Pakistan. As the future is also all those seeking to passage those waters and sands, and dine in their angry wash and sun heat if we do not act now. Which implies that if we are to learn how to be the representative claimants for those future refugees, border crossing from the future into our present organizations of power, that we must begin by building our contemporary and future commitments to a we far beyond our current lines of green life and arid life, a we well beyond our current geographic boundaries and coasts, by opening ourselves to the widening future deserts and deepening drowning pools we are already making. Which also means that if we are to be truly, urgently hospitable, another word that Paul has taught me deeply to think about, it will depend on being hospitable both to abjected life abandoned now, and by teaching ourselves to open our hospitality and our politics and our economies to all the coming lives we are already throwing beyond the arid and drowning lines of the decades and centuries to come. But will we do so? Will we faithfully take on that task of being the future claimant's representative? Will we take on that task as something urgent, non-elective, inescapable? And not just any we, but the we that is the university. Which leads me to the second part of this talk, on the university in a state of urgency. There is no end, seemingly no end. On the borders, there are camps. Between the coasts, the seas are policed. The Mediterranean waterways and refugee ways have become drowning zones. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change cannot produce emergency reports fast enough to keep pace with the warming of the planet. Media capital morphs into surveillance capital. Predatory populisms wash over liberal democracies. White supremacists in our hometown of Charlottesville, Virginia, rally to unite the right. Constitutional protections and guarantees are summarily suspended. Russia brutalizes Ukraine. Iran, revolting after the killing of Mahsa Amini, becomes the latest place to be taken off the grid, cordoned away from the world. Agonizingly check your social media. Another emergency is today or coming or has already happened. For some time now, we have encountered the situations of our times falling under one or other of these conditions of emergency. We have become accustomed to it. But there is a correlate to that grim realism. To the rippling states of emergency in which we have discovered ourselves, there is a countervailing mode of critical articulation. To every state of emergency, a call to urgency and possibility. The urgency of degrowth or a Green New Deal before the planet crosses its 4 degrees Celsius horizon into utter catastrophe. The continued urgency of Me Too accounting and of Black Lives Mattering and of reimagining the university and of rejuvenating democracy. But how should we respond to that sense of urgency? Of all the matters before us, what is most urgent? Answering those questions demands multiple lines of inquiry. It depends on investigating urgency's multiple scales of time and uneven geographies of vulnerability, on asking whether it reaches into the enduring and the anterior, or whether it most properly belongs to a radically self-demarcating now, or whether it can extend into the future, and how far so. Within the university, it provokes a renewed debate on method and on purpose, of examining, in the South African historian and critical theorist Premesh Lalu's terms, what the university is for, of considering how thought and the institution must change when and if the task of the university were to become the task of urgency. Above all, addressing this bundle of problems demands an answer to these questions. What is urgent and who is to decide? And again, in a time of democratic and global and planetary urgency, what is the university for? What is the nature of urgency? What are its key words? I have already postulated one, that to think the state of urgency is to rethink our relation to the state of emergency. The literature on emergency developed over recent years is, of course, vast. 2 single anchor points are worth noting. First, that emergency is bound up with sovereignty and with the decision. Crucially, a decision on the friend-enemy distinction. Above all, a decision on all those whose sovereign power designates as the enemy. Within the US, not always, but too often, the Muslim as enemy, the refugee as enemy, Black life as enemy, queer and trans life as enemy. Second, that the sovereign is the one, or no longer the one, increasingly the algorithm, the biometric data bank, the recognition software, capable of deciding that such enemy, suspect, abandonable life justifies the declaration of one or other state of emergency. That much is familiar and leads to this question. If urgency is emergency's counterforce, then is urgency's opening decision a decision on the friend, and Paul, to go back to our conversation earlier today, the neighbor. The one urgently due hospitality, the stranger at the door, or in the Levinasian tradition, the face at the door, the face at the border, the face in the security state's recognition software. Or as the wrenching scenes from the border and the desert and the sea and the killing zone starkly remind us, perhaps the call to urgency now does not begin with the face turned toward us, but with the face down, the face in the water, the face turned and running from the car and the gun, the face in the ground, the face in the sand. Or more starkly still, perhaps urgency now is completely faceless, beginning not with the body on the ground or in the water, but with the climate change and rising body of water, with the surge and lap of waves, with weather maps, storm centers, outward whipping bandtails lashing the coasts as hurricane follows hurricane follows hurricane, and all the bodies float. And as the dunes rise, the deserts expand, and the bodies sun-scorched fall, thirsty and desiccant. Holding those images, thinking the task of the university through them, requires a passage through a second and a third of urgency's dimensions. If urgency is indeed inextricably bound with emergency, then it must also be conceived as a matter of time and a matter of speed. To begin with time, what is the half-life of those images? How long, scant years after the event, will we remember the image of a father, Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez, and a daughter, Valeria, drowned on June 24th, 2019, trying to cross the Rio Grande? For how long after the pound of Hurricane Ian in Florida will we remember the crash of Hurricane Dorian on the Abacus Island and the Grand Bahamas? How long will we also remember those dead? For how long, when the next news cycle turns, will we remember Masa Amini's name? For how long will we remember the tortured and the dead of Bucha in Ukraine when the next war comes? Not because we are indifferent, but because the urgent moves with relentless speed and harrowing pace. That is its nature. As it is seemingly its nature to ask us to choose, not only among locations, among dispersed and overlapping geographies of vulnerability, but among timescales, among a complex range of temporal codes. For as fast as it moves, the urgent also plays up and down multiple scales of time. Among others, those scales of Anthropocene time I've touched, shifting from the daily to the millennial, from the moment-by-moment time of the individual to the nomological time of polities, to the biological time of species, and the geological time of the planet, as it meets the hourly toll of lives taken and imprisoned at the border and on the street, the surging nativist and populist assaults on democracy and polities across the globe, the sixth extinction and biodiversity catastrophes of our moment, the rising seas and spreading aridifications of climate change. Its challenge to us is to think through all those times at once, to articulate a method for doing so and to do so quickly, with little or no time to wait. For the urgent does not wait. The military and biometric policing of borders and ocean passages does not wait. Anti-democratic populism is not waiting. Resurgent race nationalism is not waiting. Species extinction is not waiting. The rising oceans do not wait. Spreading deserts and all they trap and encamp do not wait. Which returns us again to the vexing frame question: what is urgent and who is to decide? And as we decide, how should we act? What method of thought or strategic purpose should the we that is the we of the university bring to these states of urgency, and are we equipped to do so? In reflecting on those questions, I have a set of sketch postulates to offer. First postulate: The urgent is a matter of interpretation, not calculation. By this, I do not mean to be coy, but to signal a key difference between the urgent and the challenge, particularly as they appear on the contemporary global universities' horizons of strategic planning. Global grand challenges, the now default language of university strategic planning, a language I want to be clear, I also use in my role as a university provost, but I increasingly feel the need to rethink. Global grand challenges announce themselves as quantifiable and calculable. Their discourse is a discourse of verifiability, epistemological certainty, and in Mbembe's terms, datification. Their implication is that universities realize their public purpose by cultivating the disciplines best suited to these measurable tasks, and then learn from those disciplines what problems to solve and what challenges to engineer. The urgent, by contrast, begins with active interpretation arising from questions of value, ethical debate, and framing disposition, with queer and trans or liberal constitutional or feminist or subaltern or critical race or post-human or other encounters with the unresolvable and the incalculable. Second postulate, that does not mean coordinating the interpretive from the calculable. The argument I am trying to make is about points of departure, not points of refusal. If the university is to realize its democratic purpose, it will do so, I'm suggesting, by first responding to Lalu's question, first answering what it is for. Through argued and debated interpretive encounters with our multiple overlapping states of enduring purpose and urgent situation, and then directing itself to those ends across all its fields of knowledge, from the humanities to the data and statistical sciences. Third postulate, if we are to make these decisions to decide what is urgent, what the university is for, we cannot do so in the mode of the emergency decision, through acts of dictate, telling and commanding each other how to think or act. We must do so democratically. How so? There are countless answers. I want now to highlight only one. An idea from Hannah Arendt, who in her late work returned to a question political theory has raised from Plato's writings on the Republic and the laws onward in the tradition that she is drawn to. How is philosophy to discover a power to combat the power of tyrannical authority? Arendt's response is predictably complex, but it hinges on this conviction. Urgency cannot command. It must persuade. Or to cite her, quote, authority is incompatible with persuasion, which presupposes equality and works through a process of argumentation. Where arguments are used, authority is left in abeyance, unquote. Which I interpret this way. If an appeal from the condition of urgency is to open the ground for others to freely affirm that appeal, then urgency cannot dictate. It must find its power in another source, persuasion, which presupposes equality and works through a process of argumentation, persuasion, whose Latin root is suadere, which also translates to urge. At the root of persuasion, suasion. At the heart of suasion, the act of urging another. At the heart of that urging, the urgent situation, which if it is to urge us democratically, if it is to persuade us and not command us, depends on an equitable order and works through a process of free exchange, all of which, equity of belonging, unending commitment to argument, openness to our thought being changed, to persuading and being persuaded, it is the university's enduring mission to cultivate. This is the power of urgency, its democratic counter-proposition to the command of emergency. That is the egalitarian secret word openly hiding in its very verbal form. Urgency, suadere, persuasion, which is also, I believe, the power of the university and the open secret of our capacity to contest authoritarian power. Which leads me, truly in conclusion, to a body of art making the vivid case that responsibility toward the future is not something we can command. If that responsibility is to claim us, it will depend on another force, a force urgently persuading us. Or to put it another way, the aridity line, the siege line, the race line, the color line, the enemy line currently encamping the future. What is their alternative? How can we cross those lines into the besieged future? Perhaps not, after all, simply in response to a demand that we continue to move toward the future along an Enlightenment-designed and abstract path of freedom, but as the contemporary South African artist Ikshan Adams' work shows, by following an embodied and uncontained line of desire, rendering vivid a local and planetary ache and urge of freedom toward. Part 3, on desire lines. I became aware of Adams' art this past year by seeing a small scatter of his work at the Venice Biennale. His pieces hold force there, within Cecilia Alemani's Arsenale curation, The Milk of Dreams. But they are only one parcel of work among hundreds in the Biennale. The more comprehensive overview of his project comes from his 2022 solo artist show at the Art Institute of Chicago. The title of the exhibition is Desire Lines. The work shown there is striking. Adams, born the catalog of the Art Institute exhibition informs us in 1982 in the so-called colored apartheid-era township of Bonteheuwel on the Cape Flats, works with fibers, colored plastic beads, fragments of linoleum, shards of glass and detritus collected from the climate-desiccated terrain surrounding Bonteheuwel. He gathers throwaways from the sides of the itinerant pathways the people of Bonteheuwel have walked into the ground as they head between their alleys of hard brick houses and zinc and corrugated cardboard shacks, skirt sewage fills, brace the hike to the minivan taxi stands on the side of the N2 motorway that will carry them to their jobs or their hustling or their busking, or like Adams in the New South Africa, their studios and co-working spaces in Cape Town. Gathering these wandering discards, Adams weaves these bits of glinting rubbish and now and then a cowrie shell or ostrich ring into the wool skeins of large tapestries, up to 20 by 30 feet in diameter. This is the piece that was shown at Venice. The names of the works resonate. One titled in English is When Dust Settles, but most are more language thick in their vernacular, playing up and down the registers of Cape Afrikaans, the language that, like English, has blended and separated life after life, the so-called white and the black and the so-called colored, but a language that Adams has nevertheless held to, an Afrikaans that is his, and that his work joins a project of reclaiming, repairing, refashioning, and reweaving as something more than white and dividing, as also a brown language, a language of breinmense, brown people, merging histories together. His tapestries weave those skeins, defying an audience to exclude him or his family or anyone from that Cape history. One tapestry is called Stoffelijke Oorskot, earthly remains. Another, Spoersnee, tracking footprints. Earth, footprints, dust, tracking, settling, remaining, a history and a commitment. We have been here for a long time. Track our footprints. You cannot deny them. Turn the earth for our remains and the beauties we have made. They are everywhere. We are here. We have printed ourselves in this earth. Track our history. We will remain. We will continue to weave and loom ourselves into what is ours and yours and everyone's. That is what we hear in his titles, in that sparkling brown Afrikaans Adams has claimed. And then more demanding are the tapestry works themselves, the tapestry works those titles name. Viewed from a distance, they look like GIS renderings of the Earth's surface. Satellite photographs of a deserted landscape shaded in greens and browns and blues, like woven interpretations of Weitzman and Sheikh's Erasure trilogy, with which they are deeply in conversation. With here or there a pattern of lines cut across the terrain, a tracework of intersecting paths that a people cut into it. Not just the recent residents of the Cape Peninsula, but farther back still, the original inhabitants of these increasingly desertified spaces, the indigenous inhabitants of the Cape, the Khoisan, first indigenous minders and nomads of this place, who wrote their walkways and their histories, musics, gods, legends, and wonders into this terrain over a long time, slowly, deliberately, joyfully, agonizingly, resiliently furrowing their record into the ground of this tip of Africa. And then in Adam's tapestries, in the careful mix of all the flotsam he's woven in, there are further the signs of the others the Cape has gathered. Malay, Dutch, English, Xhosa, Zulu, South Indian, North Indian, Cantonese, Jewish exiles and immigrants from across multiple diasporas, Igbo, Yoruba, Tswana, Shangaan, Moroccan, Tunisian, Huguenot, Sikh, Jain, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, anarchist, capitalist, mine worker, union, all mixing and merging their paths and history on this landscape at the southern tip of Africa, a place where history's dust rises and settles, a place of history's remains and future, a place of history's footprints and converging paths. When dust settles, stoflike oorskot, earthly remains, spoorsname, tracking footprints. The purpose of those paths, as Adam's title for the Chicago show and the catalog essays reveals, is desire. Apartheid constrained movement. Desire released it. Apartheid boasted. Desire won. Across his work, Adams has been plotting the paths of those long, meandering, intersecting lines of historical desire, close to the soil, gathering desires, abandoned things, and perfume bottles, and condoms, and protea petals, and homework notebooks, and advertisements, and funeral notices, and rave party tack-ups, and civic notice gatherings, and Kwaito flyers, and ANC and DP and economic freedom fighters handouts, all spilled out along those paths of walked desire that the people of Bonteheuvel and the Cape Flats have written from apartheid to now. There is a history of policing and spontaneity and a theory of freedom through desire animating his weave. Policing is obvious. Apartheid and its police patrolled, surveilled, arrested, imprisoned, and tortured Bonteheuvel for decades. Post-apartheid poverty punishes it still. The spontaneity and freedom as lived desire in defiance of policing is less obvious until it becomes obvious. It has something to do with the practice of everyday life that I've been needing to reconsider through spending time with Adam's work while trying to think with him more carefully the idea of freedom toward. If I can summarize that thinking through his work, it is this. Don't invent a whole new system from abstraction. Pay attention to what people actually do when they desire to be free. Learn again and anew the practices of everyday life, how people walk, where they pause to eat and drink and agitate and laugh and have sex and pray. Follow the desire lines of everyday life. Be forensic of desire. Trace its spontaneities, its little ducks down an alley, along a bar of music, wandering a township, a spoorsname. Or as Adams has reimagined it in another work from his show. Follow the slow, determined back and forth pace of a grandmother, an Oma, cooking pap, pressing the footstepped memory of her life into her kitchen's linoleum flooring. Day after day after day, as by her side in that apartheid measured space, she witnesses the repeated fall of her husband's needs onto a tasseled prayer mat, marking his weight and indent onto that thin fabric, as the muezzin calls the township into prayer, day after day after day. Weave a tapestry from the example of that walked linoleum. And now do what Adams has done and pull back from all those local lines of desire and make a satellite image of them. Record Bonteheuvel's walks and paths of disobedient freedom and make a planetary image of them, woven into tapestry, opening their pathways beneath a set of sculpted floating dust clouds. Imagine the planet traced by countless, endless of those desire lines, beginning perhaps at the southern tip of Africa, traversing the continent, walking from the Cape through Namibia, Angola, Cameroon, Niger, Guinea-Bissau, Morocco, arriving not just hungry and abject, but desiring and future imagining, animated by a determined, bodily, life-risking commitment to freedom, continuing across all obstacles over the Sahel to a dinghy, risking the Mediterranean, heading to Marseille or Bologna or Paris or London, to remake again those cities, to once more reinvent Europe, to remind Europe and post-Brexit Britain of what they and we and the United States must also know, that now and over a long time we are not the centers of the world, but northern peripheries and outposts of the global South. With that in mind, think Adam's desire lines as a tracework and tapestry of that future, not just a map of the abandoned, but a map of the agents of the future, the map of the ones who will not give up on the idea of freedom, the map of the ones teaching us what it means to truly desire freedom, across every line of divide, across every apartheid, across every Kalahari and Sahel and Chihuahua and Negev and Rio Grande and Mediterranean, across every line of enmity, across every line of governmentality and environmentality and aridity and drowning. Imagine that our task is not in some impossibly abstract, data-limited, or court-ordered obligation to be bureaucratically the future claimants' representatives on behalf of an abstract idea of freedom, but to understand that those futures representatives are already among us, coming toward us, urging us to walk a line of desire into a blasted and new planetary future they are making, if only we will join in and follow. And now imagine the future walkers of those desire lines, not only the current walkers, but all the future walkers, already assembling, decade on coming decade, century on coming century, readying themselves to walk across the spreading deserts and rising rivers of the future toward us. Are we ready to welcome them and to alter our present for them? Remembering and anticipating now the joy we all know from a day of homecoming, the joy we all know from those days of jubilee, when all come home from however afar and the table is set for everyone, can we rethink our desires? As we open our door and set that feast, can we in advance experience that welcoming of these future claimants coming to our opening door as another of our most delightful, joyful, and desirable things? Which leads me, in conclusion, not to another set of postulates, but more certainly, though also hopefully, to a final set of questions. Can a freedom toward teach itself to be that meeting in the spirit of Paul's conception of conviviality, of the walking and the welcoming? Can our projects take a cue from the urgent and delighting desire of the welcoming for the walking and of the walking for the welcoming, and so teach us to fashion a history reckoning, future opening, and convivial we in the blend of the walking and the welcoming? Can we then also affirm on a simultaneously global and planetary scale the homecoming words of Aimé Césaire from his Cahiers, that it is not, quote, enough for us to walk in step with the world as it is, but to walk the world and the planet differently, and so change it by the footprints of our lives? Can we recommit in this new register, blending Césaire with Adams, to a planet work that in Césaire's words is, quote, only just beginning and remains, and in Adams to a weave work that will leave its stoffelijke oorskot, its earthy remains, on the future planet we are, without a doubt, now already making? And finally, can we hold the conviction that however hard that work will be, this promise from Césaire endures: there is a place for all at the rendezvous of victory.